A little while back, I did a video on Star Wars Legends and how to get into reading those books. I will link to it in the description, but one of the ways I described trying to do that is by reading them in the order of their original release. And today is the day we're going to start doing that. I just read Splinter of the Mind's Eye by Alan Dean Foster, and now it's time to talk about it. Some people might be surprised to know that back in my Star Wars Legends days, I did not read all of the books. I basically started with Shadows of the Empire because I wanted the full story behind the N64 game, and then I picked up Truce at Bakura, which happens right after Return of the Jedi, and I just went forward in the Star Wars chronology. I wanted to see what happened to our heroes after Return of the Jedi. I wasn't really that interested in what happened beforehand. Some people, for example, were surprised that I had never read the Han Solo trilogy until very recently, and that would be why, because I just spent most of my focus on what happened after Return of the Jedi and not before. I did read a handful here and there, especially later in my life. That's when I read like the Darth Bane trilogy and the Darth Plagueis book as I got closer to the time period where I started actually making this channel. But anyway, that's just to give you some context. I wanted to let people know when I'm reading a book for the first time and when I'm reading it for like my fifth. Well, in the case of Splinter of the Mind's Eye, this is absolutely the first time I ever read this book. And for the format of these videos, I thought it would be fun to kind of do everything that I do for a new canon book in one video. So I will be reviewing the story and talking about what I liked, what I didn't. And then I'm also going to go through some fun facts. And I thought it would be fun to look at these books through the lens of an overly analytical Star Wars fan like I am now. So we'll jump back to 1978 and maybe try to speculate on what Splinter of the Mind's Eye could be hinting at when it comes to future Star Wars stories. So hopefully that'll turn out to be fun. There will be spoilers ahead, but come on, the book is 40 years old. Splinter's story is about Luke and Leia becoming stranded on the planet Mimban on their way to a diplomatic meeting. Their ships crash and they stumble across an illegal Imperial mining operation. Gasp! The Empire is doing something they're not supposed to? No! One of the locals offers to help them get off the planet if they first help her find a legendary gem called the Kyber Crystal. She is somewhat Force sensitive and can tell Luke is strong in the Force as well, so she wants his help. The crystal has the power to expand the use of the Force in whoever is wielding it. While they trek out to find the crystal, the Empire recognizes Leia and Vader comes to try to capture her. Vader, Leia, and Luke have a fight, Vader is beaten, and everyone else exits the temple eager to leave the planet. And that's the gist of it. All things considered, it was a pretty short and small story. It actually kind of reminds me a lot of the current canon books that we're getting. The Legends books I grew up with were very expansive. They had a lot of characters, a lot of planet hopping, and it seemed like the fate of the galaxy was always at stake. Not so much here. It's just an intimate story about Luke and Leia and this ultimately inconsequential MacGuffin. The most fun thing about it now is seeing Star Wars before everything was so firmly established. The most noticeable example of that would have to be the sexual tension between Luke and Leia, which pops up early and often. I don't care how many times George Lucas claims he had the entire trilogy mapped out before they started A New Hope. He did not. And to build off of that, it's also clear at this point that Leia doesn't have any abilities in the Force. I mean, the old woman can't sense it in her, Leia can't sense any power coming from the Kyber Crystal, Vader can't sense her presence, but he can sense Luke. Now, I could of course write that off as just Leia not knowing that she's Force sensitive and not being attuned to her own abilities, but I think the implication that she is just not supposed to be Force sensitive in any way is clear at this point in time. There's also some interesting stuff about lightsabers. First of all, they're treated as if they're just this totally normal thing. Luke uses his in basically a bar brawl, and everyone he's fighting sees it, and they're just like, yeah, okay, that's not strange at all. I mean, it's basically what Obi-Wan does to Ponda Baba in the Cantina, but I'm so used to lightsabers and Jedi artifacts being treated as this illegal and rare thing that seeing people just treat it as if it's an everyday occurrence where they're like, huh, check that out. Dude has a lightsaber. Like, it's just kind of strange. And also there's a scene where Luke has to charge his lightsaber. That hasn't been addressed in the new canon, but at least as far as I can remember in Legends, lightsabers didn't need external power since the Proto-Saber days. If you don't know the history behind this book, it's actually really interesting because it was written to be the sequel to Star Wars in the event that the movie were a flop. Lucas still wanted to continue telling his story in film, but figured if the first one didn't do well at the box office, then he would just have to reduce the budget significantly. So that's why there are almost no space scenes. Han is written out completely, and almost all of the action takes place on this mist-covered planet where presumably you could just build cheap sets and then hide it with the fog. And a lot of this stuff was seriously considered to be a Star Wars movie. It would have been as real as A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, or Return of the Jedi. If that had wound up happening, I don't really hate anything in this book. I think that it's a little weird in the context of everything that we know now, but there's nothing in there that I was just like, oof, I'm glad that this is just gone forever. Obviously I don't like it as much as most of the other Star Wars stories that we get. It's not nearly as good as any of the films, and thank goodness Star Wars was a success, or else we might never have gotten The Empire Strikes Back. And speaking of Empire, something that really jumped out at me in the book is the duel between Vader, Luke, and Leia. First of all, Leia gets to fight Vader with Luke's lightsaber, and that's pretty neat. She does about as well as Luke does in The Empire Strikes Back. But then Luke gets a crack at Vader, and he does remarkably well. It goes nothing like it does in Empire. He even cuts off Vader's arm instead of Vader cutting off his hand. They seem to be pretty evenly matched for the most part. And keep in mind that Luke has had no extra training since his time with Obi-Wan Kenobi. I bring that up just to say that rapidly growing in the Force for the sake of advancing the story is not something invented by Disney. It's been happening in Star Wars for a long time. Since I brought up Disney, let's talk about Splinter of the Mind's Eye and some of the connections it has with the current canon universe. Of course, the entire book almost takes place on the planet Mimban. It was mentioned in the Clone Wars, and of course more recently showed up in Solo, a Star Wars story. The book places it in the Serkarpus sector of the galaxy under the rule of Moff Esada, and all of that is still true in canon thanks to the Solo visual guide. Finally, the Mimbanese people, also known as the Kawe in the book, very closely resemble the Mimbanese people seen in the movie, again very briefly, but they are red-skinned people with large eyes that live underground, and I think all those connections are pretty cool. And the final thing I want to do in this review is pretend that we are Star Wars fans in 1978 reading this book for the first time. Let's pretend that we know The Empire Strikes Back is coming out, and Splinter of the Mind's Eye is the one story that's going to bridge the gap between A New Hope and Empire. If we read this book, what would we think were the clues being dropped about The Empire Strikes Back? What could we expect to see in future stories? Well, very early on, Luke wonders if Ben Kenobi is truly dead, and that could imply that the character will return in the next movie. Obviously, Luke and Leia will fall for each other since Han is seemingly out of the picture and is only vaguely mentioned once. For the second story in a row, Vader is a threat to Luke that winds up humiliated, having to run off with his tail between his legs. Vader is a joke. How are we supposed to be scared of him in the next movie? Luke's already beaten him twice now. Who cares about Vader anymore? Gosh, that's really reminding me of something relevant I keep hearing people whine about. Luke has to fight and defeat the strongest warrior of the Kawe people. He wins, and the Kawe admire his skills in battle, but Luke feels shame at being praised for excelling at violence. So maybe Luke will wind up rejecting violence down the line. I bring up those points mostly just for fun. Some of those things we know happen, like Obi-Wan's return, and some of those things are obviously wrong and they never happen, and then some of them I never would have picked up on if I didn't already know the story through Return of the Jedi. But I do think it's pretty interesting that Luke's rejection of violence and the dark side, the seeds for that are starting to be planted already in this book. But that's about all I have to say about Splinter of the Mind's Eye. I wouldn't call it a must-read by any means, even if you're trying to get into Star Wars Legends for the first time. If you want to see the direction that Star Wars almost went, or if you just want to see what Star Wars was like before everything was so firmly established, you will probably be entertained by this book. It's not really that long, so I would recommend it in that case. Before wrapping up, I wanted to give a couple quick shoutouts. First to my friends at Legends Library. They have a podcast where they read and discuss Legends books, and I've been on a handful of times. Randy and Luke are great guys, so give them a look, and I'll put a link to that in the description. Also, I want to mention Utini, which is a Star Wars book subscription box you can sign up for to get a new Star Wars book sent to you every month. This is not a paid ad or affiliate deal or anything, I just think it's a cool service. You can tell them what books you already have, and then once a month they'll send you a new canon or Legends book or graphic novel. If you want to learn more about them, you can check out the other link in the description. I also wanted to let you know about a really fun video Mr. Sunday Movies did about Splinter of the Mind's Eye. He describes the story to someone who hasn't read it, and I've got to say, it's really damn funny. And if you want a better and more entertaining summary of the story, you can check that out. I'm not sure when the next Journey Through Legends video will drop, but we will be covering Han Solo at Star's End, which came out in 1979, so get started reading that if you want to follow along. If you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and consider checking out our Patreon page. As always, thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you.